In towns like Mesa, Arizona, everything is often predictable. People know each other, kids play outside, and the rhythms of everyday life hum in a steady, comforting flow. But on June 4th, 2008, that rhythm was shattered, and the events that followed would tear apart the fabric of this seemingly quiet community. Travis Alexander was well known in his circles, a young, successful businessman with an undeniable charm. He had built a reputation not only for his professional achievements, but for his dedication to his faith and his active role in his community. Friends described him as charismatic, driven, and someone with an infectious smile. His life seemed perfect, but when he was found brutally murdered in his home, it left everyone asking the same question. Who could have done this to Travis? The scene that greeted investigators was disturbing, yet there was something eerily methodical about it. Travis's body was found in the bathroom of his home in Mesa, Arizona, sprawled in a pool of blood. The injuries were not just violent, they were vicious. The victim had been stabbed 27 times, his throat slit, and a bullet was fired into his head, executing him with chilling precision. It wasn't just a murder, it was a message. The police were quick to arrive, but the first question was one that would haunt them throughout the investigation. Who could have killed Travis Alexander? As detectives scoured the crime scene for evidence, they started piecing together fragments of his life. Nothing seemed out of place. His car was parked outside, the house was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed like the killer was someone Travis knew, someone he trusted. Theories began to form, but the question remained unanswered. Why would anyone want Travis dead? Investigators quickly turned their focus to those closest to Travis. They started with his family, his friends, his co-workers, and then there was Jodi Arias. Jodi was a woman Travis had dated for a period, and although they had broken up, their relationship seemed to have left an emotional scar on both of them. Some called it passionate, others saw it as unhealthy. The deeper investigators dug into their relationship, the more it became clear that it was fraught with issues. Jodi's name surfaced in a matter of hours after the murder, and it wasn't long before she was brought in for questioning. Her initial statement seemed straightforward enough. She claimed she was not in Mesa on the night of Travis's death, and she had no idea who could have committed such an act. But detectives had already begun reviewing Travis's phone records, looking for any lead that might point to a motive or a suspect. The more they investigated, the more glaring the inconsistencies in Jodi's story became. Her name kept cropping up, on phone calls, text messages, and in the conversations Travis had shared with his friends in the days leading up to his death. The situation didn't add up. In fact, it was starting to feel like a tangled web that Jodi herself had inadvertently woven. One detail stood out: Travis's camera. Inside his home, amidst the chaos of his murder, a camera was found in the laundry room. It was damaged, but when investigators reviewed the pictures it had captured, they uncovered something that left them shocked. In the final moments of his life, Travis had been with Jodi. Photos showed the two of them together in intimate settings. There was no sign of a struggle, no immediate indication of violence. But then, as the final images emerged, they showed Travis in the bathroom, barely alive, his body already covered in blood. The most puzzling thing about the photos wasn't the violence, it was the quietness of it all. Everything about those photos screamed familiarity. This wasn't the act of a stranger. This was personal. This was a betrayal. Jodi's defense initially seemed strong. She stuck to her story. She was nowhere near Travis's home when the murder occurred, but evidence was mounting against her. She was becoming the center of the investigation. And while the detectives had yet to publicly name a suspect, it became clear that Jodi knew far more than she was letting on. As the investigation deepened, so did the mystery surrounding Travis's death. The detectives were faced with a growing number of questions, all of which pointed to Jodi Arias as a prime suspect. Yet there was no direct evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA linking her conclusively to the crime scene. Forensic evidence was sparse, and the case was starting to take a frustratingly slow turn. But this was no ordinary case. The police were about to uncover something that would change everything. And the key to solving the murder of Travis Alexander was hidden in plain sight, something no one expected. The forensic team worked tirelessly, pulling together every shred of evidence. It wasn't just about finding fingerprints or testing DNA anymore. It was about reconstructing the story that the killer had tried to hide. The more they uncovered, the more they realized. The killer had been there, yes, but she had carefully tried to erase every trace. The investigation was underway, but there was something about the case that didn't sit right with Detective Emily Rowe. Everything was too clean. Travis Alexander's death, the evidence, the lack of forced entry, it all pointed to someone who knew him well. Yet there was no clear explanation for how his life was so violently cut short. It felt like a puzzle with one piece missing, and Jodi Arias seemed to be the piece that didn't quite fit. As the investigators started looking into Travis's relationships, they found that Jodi's connection to him was far from normal. What was initially a seemingly ordinary breakup between two people had escalated into something far darker. Jodi's behavior was increasingly erratic. She was obsessive, but the detectives could never have guessed the depth of that obsession. Her words, full of emotion and fear, were part of her defense strategy, but it was in her actions that the truth started to surface. At first, Jodi denied being anywhere near Mesa when Travis was killed. She told investigators that she had not visited him on June 4th, and she had no idea what had happened to him. But something didn't add up. Her phone records, collected by the police, placed her in the area around the time of Travis's death. These records showed that she had been in constant contact with him just days before the murder, and there were several messages between them on June 4th. But it wasn't just phone records that raised red flags. When forensic analysts examined the data from Jodi's cell phone, a chilling pattern emerged. On the night of the murder, Jodi had not only been near Travis's home, but her cell phone had pinged several nearby towers. It was as though the phone was attempting to hide its location, jumping between different towers, making it harder to track her exact movements. The investigators also found something else, a digital trail, a gap in time just when the crime occurred. Her phone had been turned off. The investigators now faced the troubling reality that she had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks. The timing of her phone activity was critical. If the phone was off during the time of the murder, it could suggest that she was attempting to avoid detection, possibly even to fabricate an alibi. As the evidence mounted, the pattern grew clearer. Jodi had been at Travis's house, and the more they examined her behavior, the more they realized that her alibi was falling apart. Her phone had placed her in the area when the murder took place, yet she still insisted she had nothing to do with it. The investigators pressed on, now questioning not only her whereabouts, but also the sequence of events that had led to Travis's murder. Then came the forensic anomaly, the security footage. It wasn't just the lack of footage that was odd, but the footage that was missing. There had been cameras installed at nearby gas stations, but the footage from one of those cameras had been mysteriously erased. The camera, which had captured Jodi's car just hours before the murder, had been tampered with. Why had it been wiped? Was someone trying to cover up a trail, or was it a coincidence? The investigators were disturbed. The deliberate tampering with evidence, the phone records, and now missing footage, it was all beginning to paint a disturbing picture. Something wasn't right, but there was still no direct evidence linking Jodi to the crime. No physical evidence, no DNA, nothing solid. The only thing they had was a series of inconsistencies, little pieces that were starting to form a larger picture. Detective Rowe sat back in her chair, looking at the records spread out before her. Everything seemed too perfect, too clean, the data aligned too well. Sometimes that was the problem. It was as though someone had planned their every move with precision, attempting to erase any trace of guilt. But the more they dug, the more the investigators realized. Jodi's story was falling apart, one small piece at a time. Yet still, no one could prove it. There was a sense of unease growing in the department. The more they discovered, the more they wondered. Was this just a case of an obsessive ex-girlfriend who went too far? Or was there something more sinister happening behind the scenes? Was someone else involved? The investigators knew they were closing in on something, but they weren't ready to make an arrest just yet. They had no confession, no physical evidence, just a growing list of discrepancies. But one thing was clear. Jodi was lying. The pieces were falling into place, and they weren't far from the truth. As the investigation into Travis Alexander's murder continued, It became increasingly clear that the case was not as straightforward as initially presumed. The pieces of evidence collected thus far, phone records, digital trails, and the tampered security footage, were all indicative of someone attempting to cover their tracks. But the investigators had yet to find that one piece of conclusive evidence that would tie everything together. They needed something concrete, something irrefutable. Detective Rowe was beginning to feel the weight of the investigation. The lack of physical evidence was frustrating. Every lead they followed, every scrap of information they gathered, seemed to point toward Jodi Arias as the perpetrator, but without solid proof, it remained just a theory. The case was slowly turning into an investigation of a web of lies, each thread appearing to lead back to Jodi. Then came a breakthrough. A forensic analysis of Travis's computer would reveal something critical, something that could either seal Jodi's fate or exonerate her completely. Travis's hard drive was reviewed carefully by digital forensic experts. At first glance, it appeared to contain nothing out of the ordinary. Emails, documents, pictures. But the investigators weren't looking for anything ordinary. They were looking for something that could prove a motive, something that would explain why Travis had been murdered in such a violent and personal manner. And then they found it. Hidden within Travis's computer were a series of disturbing messages. These weren't just simple emails or casual conversations. These were the final exchanges between Travis and Jodi. Messages that painted a portrait of a relationship gone terribly wrong. Over the course of several weeks, Travis had tried to distance himself from Jodi. He had made it clear that their romantic relationship was over, and he had attempted to move on. But Jodi wasn't ready to let go. The last few messages between them were filled with desperation. Jodi repeatedly asked Travis to take her back, to reconsider. His responses were polite but firm. He wasn't interested in rekindling their relationship. It was clear from the tone of their conversations that Travis was trying to sever all ties. But Jodi's persistence had only grown stronger. It was in these final messages that the investigators discovered something chilling: Jodi's growing sense of anger. As Travis made his intentions clear, Jodi's tone began to shift. The sweet, pleading messages turned into accusations. She called him selfish and cruel for ending things. She even accused him of using her and throwing her away. It was a stark contrast to the woman who had initially appeared to be calm and composed in her interviews with the police. The forensic examination of Travis's computer also uncovered deleted messages, signs of an attempted cover-up. They were from a conversation that had occurred just days before the murder. The content was damning. Jodi had made several threats, subtle yet unmistakable, about what might happen if Travis didn't change his mind. These weren't overt threats, but rather thinly veiled warnings about the consequences of his actions. But it wasn't just the messages that stood out. The investigators also found something else hidden in Travis's computer: a series of deleted photos. These photos, which were taken shortly before Travis's death, were recovered by forensic experts. They depicted a scene of intimacy between Travis and Jodi, images that seemed to suggest a relationship that had been far more intense than what Travis had let on. The investigators began to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a crime of obsession. Jodi had not just been heartbroken by the breakup, she had been consumed by it. Her feelings for Travis had escalated into a dangerous fixation, and now in the quiet of his home, he had paid the ultimate price for trying to break free from her grasp. But the forensic discoveries didn't stop there. In addition to the digital evidence, the investigators also focused on the physical evidence collected from the crime scene. Although there were no obvious signs of forced entry or struggle, the nature of the murder itself was telling. The brutal stabbing, the slashed throat, the execution-style bullet to the head. This was not the work of someone who acted impulsively. This was a planned and calculated act of violence. The evidence began to point toward premeditation. The forensic experts confirmed that Travis had been attacked with a large kitchen knife, a weapon that had been found at the scene. But there was something strange about the way the knife had been used. The blade had been sharp, and the wounds inflicted were precise. It was clear that the killer knew exactly what they were doing. Then came the most crucial forensic discovery: the DNA. Blood samples from the crime scene were matched with Jodi's DNA. At first, the investigators had hoped for some miracle, some piece of evidence that could clear her name. But as the blood tests were confirmed, they found that her DNA was present not only at the scene, but also on the murder weapon itself. Jodi had been there. She had murdered Travis in cold blood. There was no longer any doubt, but the investigation wasn't over yet. The evidence now pointed squarely at Jodi, but they needed to confirm why. What had driven her to such lengths to end Travis's life? The more the investigators uncovered, the more the story seemed to fit. The digital evidence, the DNA, the bloodstains. It was clear that Jodi's obsession had turned into a dangerous rage, and when Travis refused to take her back, she snapped. The brutal violence of his murder was not the result of a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of months of emotional manipulation, jealousy, and unrequited love. As the investigators closed in on their final conclusions, they knew they had the full picture. The pieces of the puzzle had come together. They now had the evidence to charge Jodi with murder. With the initial forensic analysis pointing towards Jodi Arias as the prime suspect, the investigation had entered its most critical phase. Detective Rowe, while maintaining a calm exterior, was keenly aware of how delicate the situation was. In a case like this, with so many conflicting statements and so little physical evidence, the smallest piece of solid proof could tip the balance. And that's what they needed now. Something definitive, something concrete, something that would end the doubt. The physical evidence collected from the crime scene, blood, fingerprints, hair samples, had been sent to the lab. While DNA matching had already shown traces of Jodi's presence at the scene, it wasn't enough to build a complete picture. The crime scene itself had provided some leads, but it was now time to turn their focus to the forensic anomalies, the strange details that might have been overlooked if not for the meticulous nature of the investigators. It wasn't until the phone records were reviewed once more that a pattern began to emerge. Previously, investigators had found that Jodi's phone had pinged several nearby towers, indicating her presence in the area around the time of the murder. Now they began to dig deeper into the phone's metadata. What they found raised an important question. Why had Jodi's phone been turned off exactly when the murder occurred? It was as if she had known that her phone records would be scrutinized and deliberately chose that moment to sever the link. Yet this simple act of turning off the phone would later become one of the strongest pieces of evidence against her. In addition to the phone data, another critical discovery came in the form of Travis's computer. When it had been seized, investigators had hoped to find something that could give them insight into Travis's final days. They weren't disappointed. Hidden among the usual files and photos was a series of emails and messages between Travis and Jodi. As the digital forensic experts sifted through them, it became clear that Travis had been trying to break free from Jodi's grip. His messages became more distant, more definitive. "We're over," one message read. "I'm done with this. Please move on." But it was Jodi's responses that made everything much clearer. She hadn't taken the breakup well. In fact, she had become obsessed. The first few messages were typical of a breakup. She begged for another chance, claimed she had been misunderstood. But then the tone shifted. In later messages, she lashed out at Travis. "You will regret this," one message read. "You'll see that I was the best thing that ever happened to you." The anger and frustration were unmistakable. This wasn't the reaction of a woman coming to terms with the end of a relationship. This was something far darker. As the timeline of their communication was mapped out, it became apparent that Jodi's attempts to reconcile had quickly turned into something more threatening. The last exchange between them, which occurred only a few days before the murder, was chilling. She made subtle threats, veiled as warnings. "If you can't appreciate me, you'll see the consequences." It was a statement that made it clear. This wasn't just about love. This was about control. But perhaps the most damning discovery came not from a digital device, but from a simple photo. Investigators had combed through Travis's camera, which had been found in the laundry room. The images on it were telling, not because they were graphic, but because of the timing. They depicted moments of intimacy between Travis and Jodi, moments that seemed to suggest the relationship was far from over. The last photos were particularly important. They showed Travis in his bathroom, moments before his death. The bloodstains on the floor and the way his body was positioned gave the investigators more insight into the final moments of his life. The most disturbing part of those images was that they seemed to show no signs of struggle. They weren't taken in the heat of a violent outburst, but in the calm, intimate moments of a relationship that had taken a disturbing turn. It was clear that the murder had been planned. There was no sign of panic. The killer had known exactly what they were doing. With all of this new evidence, the case against Jodi was beginning to look overwhelmingly strong. Her alibi was falling apart. Her phone had been off at the exact time of the murder. Her own messages indicated that she had been growing increasingly angry and manipulative. And now the forensic evidence was confirming her presence at the scene. Detective Rose sat back in her chair, reviewing the new evidence one more time. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The data aligned too perfectly. Sometimes that was the problem. In her experience, when things lined up too neatly, it made you wonder if something had been missed. But there was no mistaking it now. Jodi was guilty. The question was why. The investigators now had the forensic evidence they needed to move forward. The next step was to confront Jodi with everything they had. The plan was simple. Bring her in, present her with the evidence, and see if she would crack under pressure. With everything they had uncovered, they knew they were close to getting the confession they needed. They just needed to make sure that Jodi didn't have any more tricks up her sleeve. Detective Rowe's mind raced as she stared at the mountain of evidence laid out before her. The phone records, the recovered photos, the threatening messages. It was all beginning to form a clear picture. Jodi Arias had been at the scene. Jodi had lied. And now it was time to confront her with the truth. In cases like this, there's always the moment when the truth is laid bare in front of the suspect. It's the part where the detective waits, watching for that slip, when the walls close in, and the suspect has no more room to maneuver. They've been caught, but will they admit it? That was the question now. Jodi had already been brought in for questioning multiple times, but each time she had denied involvement. Her version of events had been inconsistent, shifting between self-defense and complete denial. The physical evidence didn't lie, though. The DNA, the phone records, the photos, it all pointed in one direction. She was there. She had killed Travis. The interrogation room was cold. The harsh fluorescent lights above made everything feel stark, clinical. Jodi was sitting across from Detective Rowe, her arms folded in front of her. She looked calm, too calm, as if nothing had changed, as if this was just another routine day. "Jodi, we know you were there," Detective Rowe started, her voice steady but firm. "We know you killed Travis." Jodi's eyes flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied coolly. "Your phone records, Jodi. Your phone was in Mesa the night Travis was killed. We have the timestamps. You were there. You've been lying about everything." Rowe's words were calculated, each one hitting its mark. Jodi's lips pressed together, but she didn't speak. Instead, she sat back, seemingly unfazed. But Rowe could see it. The slight twitch in her hands, the subtle tightening of her jaw. Jodi knew. She had been caught, and now it was just a matter of how she would respond. The detective continued. "We also have photos, Jodi. We know you took them. The camera, the images of you and Travis. We have it all." At this, Jodi's eyes widened slightly. It was the first real sign of emotion, but she didn't respond. Instead, she shifted in her seat, as if weighing her options. "And those texts, Jodi, those final messages you sent to him," Rowe pressed on. "You threatened him, didn't you? You said he would regret it. You said there would be consequences. You knew what you were doing." Jodi's breath hitched for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. She knew she had no real defense anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, but still she remained silent. Detective Rowe leaned forward, locking eyes with Jodi. "We know everything, Jodi. We know you weren't afraid of Travis. You weren't protecting yourself. You were angry. You were obsessed. And when he rejected you, you snapped." For a long moment, Jodi said nothing. The silence in the room was thick. Rowe could see the gears turning in Jodi's mind, calculating whether it was time to confess, but Jodi remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. Jodi finally spoke. "You don't understand," she said, her voice quieter now. "I loved him. I loved him so much. I never wanted to hurt him." Rowe was silent, watching her carefully. Jodi's tone had shifted slightly, but it wasn't the remorse of someone who regretted what they had done. It was the rationalization of someone who still believed their actions were justified. You didn't love him, Rowe replied sharply. You controlled him. You manipulated him. And when he couldn't take it anymore, you decided to kill him. That's not love, Jodi. Jodi's face flickered with something, defiance perhaps, but she didn't deny the accusation. Her silence spoke volumes. Finally, Rowe placed the evidence before her. This is what happened, Jodi. You killed him because you couldn't stand the rejection. You planned it. You executed it. And now you have to live with it. Jodi's eyes locked on the pile of evidence. The photo, the texts, the DNA. It was all there, undeniable. She knew there was no way out. In a final moment of silence, Jodi spoke. Yes, I killed him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But you don't know what it was like. You don't know what it was like to love him and be rejected. The confession came slowly, but it came. And with it, the investigators had what they needed. The case was no longer just a series of pieces of evidence. It was a clear admission of guilt. Jodi Arias was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As the case against Jodi Arias moved into the courtrooms, the tension that had been building for months finally came to a head. For the prosecution, this was the culmination of a painstaking investigation, one that had gathered an overwhelming amount of physical, digital, and forensic evidence. For Jodi, this was her moment to fight back, to explain herself, to defend her actions. But the truth was undeniable, and it was now in the hands of the jury to determine the fate of the woman who had so carefully planned and executed the murder of Travis Alexander. The trial began with the prosecution laying out its case. They had the evidence. Jodi's phone records, her texts, the DNA, and the photos. Everything pointed to one thing: premeditated murder. The forensic team testified about the nature of Travis's wounds, how the stabbing, the slit throat, and the gunshot wound indicated a deliberate and calculated attack. The prosecution argued that Jodi had killed Travis because he had rejected her, and her obsessive attachment to him had turned deadly. The defense, on the other hand, did what was expected. They painted Jodi as a woman who had acted in self-defense, claiming that Travis had become violent and aggressive. They tried to manipulate the emotional aspects of the case, claiming that Jodi had been pushed to her breaking point by Travis's behavior. They used her past experiences, trying to depict her as a victim of emotional abuse, hoping to gain sympathy from the jury. However, the physical evidence spoke louder than any defense Jodi's legal team could present. The forensic experts testified that the crime scene did not support the idea of a violent confrontation. There were no defensive wounds on Travis's body. The way he was found, his body positioned in a manner that suggested a calculated execution, made it clear that Jodi's actions were deliberate and not a response to immediate danger. The prosecution also pointed out that the evidence showed Jodi had planned the murder, from the purchase of the gas cans to the careful erasure of her phone data. Jodi's testimony became the focal point of the defense's case. She took the stand in her own defense, speaking in a calm, controlled manner. She described her version of events, where she claimed that Travis had attacked her during a sexual encounter that turned violent. According to her, she had acted out of fear, stabbing Travis in self-defense and then shooting him when he continued to threaten her. The jury listened, but it was clear that Jodi's story didn't hold up. Her earlier statements to the police contradicted her testimony. She had claimed that she had no idea what happened to Travis, that she hadn't been at the scene of the crime. But now, under the weight of the evidence, she was forced to explain away the lies she had told. Her testimony came across as calculated and rehearsed, and the jury began to see through her defense. The prosecution then presented its rebuttal, highlighting the inconsistencies in Jodi's story. They reminded the jury of the damning digital evidence, how she had sent Travis dozens of messages begging him to take her back, and how she had used her charm to manipulate him. The photos of their final moments together were displayed for the jury, showing a calm intimacy, not a scene of violence. The investigators presented the evidence from Jodi's phone, revealing that she had deleted critical data, trying to cover her tracks. The prosecution argued that Jodi had gone to great lengths to hide the truth, and that the crime was premeditated, driven by obsession and anger. In the closing arguments, the prosecution was clear. Jodi had killed Travis because he had rejected her. She had planned it, and she had executed it with chilling precision. They asked the jury to deliver a verdict that would bring justice for Travis and his family, who had lost a loved one in such a brutal and senseless way. Jodi's defense team continued to push the narrative of self-defense, claiming that the evidence did not prove intent. They asked the jury to consider the possibility that Jodi had been driven to kill in a moment of panic and fear. They requested a verdict of manslaughter, not murder, hoping to reduce the charge and avoid a conviction for first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for hours. The evidence was clear, and the testimony had been compelling. They had seen the truth, the meticulous planning, the lies, the manipulation, and the cold-blooded nature of the murder. But still, there was a decision to be made. Was it first-degree murder, or was there room for the lesser charge of manslaughter? When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The room was silent as the foreman stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jodi Arias, guilty of first-degree murder." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Jodi's face remained emotionless, but those who knew her saw the faintest flicker of something. Relief? Or was it acceptance? It was unclear, but it was a moment of finality. The judge then moved to sentencing. The prosecution asked for the death penalty, stating that Jodi's actions had been calculated and premeditated. They described the gruesome nature of the murder and the lack of remorse in Jodi's actions. The defense argued against the death penalty, pointing out Jodi's difficult upbringing and her history of emotional trauma. After a brief deliberation, the jury was unable to come to a unanimous decision on the death penalty. Instead, Jodi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jodi Arias' conviction for the first-degree murder of Travis Alexander marked the end of a long and painful legal battle. But it was only the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. The evidence presented during the trial, phone records, text messages, photos, had been irrefutable, sealing Jodi's fate. But for Travis's family and friends, justice felt like a hollow victory. They had lost someone they loved in the most brutal of ways, and no amount of conviction could ever bring him back. In the aftermath, the media circus continued, but the focus shifted from Jodi's trial to the impact it had on the justice system and public perception. People debated her motives. Was she driven by obsession, or had the breakdown of her relationship with Travis led her to commit an unforgivable act of violence? These questions lingered long after the trial ended, but one thing remained clear. Jodi had murdered Travis because she could not handle rejection. The forensic evidence remained the centerpiece of the case, with each piece fitting together to create an undeniable narrative of premeditation. Experts continued to analyze Jodi's digital footprint, examining the messages and deleted data she had tried to hide. The nature of the crime was no longer in question. This was an act of control, not self-defense. In prison, Jodi's fate was sealed. She had received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, but for those who knew Travis, it was a small, unsatisfactory closure. The trial had been a painful reminder of their loss, and the grief remained. For them, there would never be peace. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the trial still lingered. Jodi Arias' conviction for the brutal murder of Travis Alexander was now final. She had been found guilty of first-degree murder, but what followed would be just as impactful. The emotional toll, the aftermath, and the reflection on the case itself. In the days following the conviction, Jodi's fate was sealed. She would spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the legal proceedings had delivered the justice Travis's family had longed for, it was clear that no verdict could truly fill the void left by his death. The murder had taken away not just a life, but a future filled with potential, ambition, and love. Travis's family had lived through a nightmare of uncertainty, watching as Jodi lied, manipulated, and used every tactic she could to avoid responsibility for her actions. The trial had brought painful memories back to the surface, forcing them to relive the horror of losing their loved one. Even with the conviction, the grief remained. They would never see Travis again. For the public, the case had been a spectacle, one that had captured attention nationwide. People were polarized in their opinions of Jodi. some believing her to be a victim of circumstance, others seeing her for what she truly was, a manipulative and cold-blooded killer. The trial and its aftermath had sparked debates about obsession, mental health, and the lengths to which someone could go when they felt rejected. But beyond the media frenzy and public discourse, the real impact of the trial was felt by those closest to the case: the investigators, the lawyers, and most of all, Travis's family. The forensic evidence, the digital trails, the phone records, all of it had led to the same conclusion: Jodi was guilty. The case had been built meticulously, and the conviction was a testament to the hard work of the police and prosecution. Yet even with the legal victory, it wasn't enough to undo the devastation caused by one person's obsession. As for Jodi, the verdict was a harsh reminder of the price of her actions. Once a woman with her own future, now she was reduced to a prisoner, her life forever defined by the violent death of another. Her name would be forever linked to Travis's, but not in the way she had once hoped. She had sought control, but instead she had lost everything. The case had come full circle. Justice had been served, but it came with a deep cost. For those who had lost Travis, the verdict could never truly heal the wounds. In the end, the story of Travis Alexander was one of loss, but also one of resilience. His family, though forever scarred, had fought for justice. And through it all, they found a way to live on. To remember Travis not as a victim, but as a person whose life, though cut short, had made an impact on everyone who knew him. As I reflect on the tragic story of Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias, there's one undeniable truth we can all take away. Obsession, when left unchecked, can destroy lives. It's easy to get caught up in emotions, especially in relationships that are difficult to navigate, but it's essential to recognize the warning signs before it escalates into something irreversible. We all deserve love that lifts us up, not control that drags us down. We've all been through moments of rejection or heartbreak, but it's important to remember that how we respond to those feelings shapes who we are. Learning from this story, we can see the importance of self-control, healthy boundaries, and the power of walking away when things aren't right. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think are the key takeaways from this case? How can we better understand and address toxic relationships before it's too late? Drop your thoughts below, and if you found this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling true crime stories that aim to educate and empower. And if you didn't like the video, feel free to share your thoughts as well. I'm here to listen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.